How's it going, viewers? Welcome back to another video, and it is another week, another race, another weekend review, this time with better quality, because I know not to get copyright striked by Formula 1 for using their footage, so that's not going to happen again. So we've got better quality, got a lot to talk about. We're kind of not really going to talk about the sprint and sprint qualifying too much, because then it's going to turn into a 2-hour video. So we're going to have a chat about qualifying, have a chat about the race, have a look at my predictions from earlier in the week, and we are going to call it there. I should hopefully have some questions coming in from some of you in a moment, but without further ado, let's get straight into the chatter. Okay, so we're going to get into it with the start of this video. We're going to start with qualifying. As always, I am going to try and do each segment in one take, because I'm not having hay fever today. But let's see. Firstly, I guess we're going to talk about... Obviously, it was Antonelli's first pole position in his career, but I think we're going to talk about the slightly more important issue than that, which was George Russell's engine issue at the start of Q3. Now, obviously, going around the track, going into Q3, we were thinking it's probably going to be the same thing. George will qualify on pole, maybe 2 tenths ahead of Antonelli or so. That's how it happened for sprint qualifying. It's how it happened in Australia. But no, the Mercedes decided to get stuck in first gear. So essentially what happened was, going around, the car sort of began to shut down. It wasn't electrical. It all seemed to be within the transmission. It stopped out on track, so it stalled, it cut the engine, whatever. It then fired up again somehow. I don't know if that is down to George getting it started again or whatever, but it restarted. But then once it did, it was stuck in first gear. So, obviously, if you saw the clip of it going and making those really awful rev noises, that's basically it being stuck in gear and struggling to find revs to rev at a consistent sort of speed. So that's why it makes that jumping noise. And you saw it on the back straight. It was, it was like jumping along the track as it went along. That's because it was stuck in gear. And I guess it leads you on to the question, and the big question from qualifying, is that if George hadn't have had that failure, would he have out-qualified Antonelli? It's hard to say, because Antonelli did have the pace. I think, honestly, if George doesn't have that issue, and he does qualifying as normal, I reckon they would have been within a tenth of each other. Which way it goes, you could kind of say it could go either way between the two. Like, Antonelli had the pace to be in front of George. George had the pace to be in front of Antonelli. It was sort of chopping and changing throughout that session. So, it could go either way. But I think if George hadn't have had that issue, they probably would have been within a tenth of each other, which is good to see, because I think it actually does mean we're going to get a title fight. Going into this season, I was thinking, okay, so George is going to be clear for the first 5 races, and then we'll get to Canada or wherever, and then Antonelli will start to be on his pace, and then we're going to start getting changes at the top. I didn't think it was going to start happening in round 2. So, honestly, I think it bodes, in terms of a neutral perspective, as one who maybe doesn't like either, or isn't a fan of anybody and is just watching for the racing, I think it definitely bodes well in that regard for the rest of the season, the fact that Antonelli is on pace already. So that's good. But anyway, we're going to move on to Antonelli's pole position lap. Obviously, with George conking out, it gave George less time. Well, essentially, it gave him one less lap, because in between Q2 and Q3 sessions, and this goes with all qualifying and practice, when you have breaks in between sessions, you kind of... It's hard to explain, but you kind of undial out of what you're doing. if that makes any sort of sense. So it's like you do Q2, and you go out and you do your laps, and you'd be properly locked in to the lap you're doing, and you'd be able to hook up a nice lap, and you do that. Then in between Q2 and Q3, you go back to the pits for 5 minutes, and in that 5 minutes, it's very easy to lose focus, and then especially when you're having an engine failure, your mind gets very preoccupied with trying to fix the engine. So it would have hampered George in that regard. It's, you look at world champions past, you look at Michael Schumacher, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, Alain Prost, etc. And they are able to switch back into race mode once a problem has been fixed. I'm not saying George can't do that. I'm just saying it is the trait of a champion to be able to do that. But regardless, Antonelli set the fastest time quite convincingly over the Ferraris. I just don't think anybody has the one lap speed to match Merc like over one lap. Obviously, you look at a team like McLaren, who are using that Mercedes engine and do have a chance at matching them over one lap. They're not there yet, but looking at Ferrari, I don't think Ferrari at all this season will have the one lap speed to go for pole. But I think if McLaren begin to get their act together, especially when it comes to reliability, I think they could be in the fight for pole position maybe halfway through this season. Because you saw Lando Norris, he was very briefly in third place ahead of some of the Ferraris. Piastri was in there as well. So it's not an impossibility, but I think if you were to pick anybody to challenge Merc, is like later on in the season, in terms of going for pole, you would have to pick McLaren, purely because they have that engine package. But if that happens, it would be very interesting. But moving on, the next thing I've got in my notes is the one spin we had in qualifying, which was Bortoleto, obviously coming out of the... Well, sorry, it was more going into the final corner. Sort of got up on the curb a bit, went to turn in, and it sort of got this sort of swapper on. And then as he tried to correct it, it does that high side and tank slapper and flicks the other way. And off you go into the wall. Very reminiscent, in a way, of Alex Albon 2019. The way it snaps right over into that wall on the outside, and it has sort of become, and I might be nitpicking a bit here, but it has sort of been a theme with Audi. They seem to have a fairly quick package. They're mixing it in with Haas and Alpine when they're on the track, which isn't easy. Alpine seem to have a decent car, but we'll get into that in a moment in the race. But they're mixing it in with Haas and Alpine, who have been the standout midfield teams so far this year, which is a big positive. But every time you look at a Hülkenberg onboard, a Bortoleto onboard, etc., it just looks so temperamental to drive. They're constantly swapping around. You saw it in testing in Bahrain, how they were constantly locking up and fighting the car, especially through turns 1 and turn 10. And then in China, you have Bortoleto going off at the final corner. So it very much it seems like a quick car, but it seems like a very unstable car to drive. That'll all come down to setup and how they've designed the chassis. Obviously, there was talk about them going with a different concept, having quite square side pods. So that could factor into it. But it does look like a very temperamental car to drive, which can be rewarding in the hands of some, can be unrewarding in the hands of some. It's just a matter of getting to know your car as quickly as possible. And for the most part, it seems like Hülkenberg is kind of dialed into the Audi. Obviously, he's been pretty unlucky with engine reliability. Obviously, he didn't start in Australia, and he broke down in the sprint. But it seems to be, in terms of getting the performance out of the car, it seems like Hulkenberg, I think, has the edge over Bortoleto at the moment. But we're going to move on to the final point that I have for qualifying, and that is that Cadillac, Aston Martin, and Williams are kind of looking like HRT, Virgin, and Caterham from the early 2010s. For those of you that are not familiar, in 2010, we had 3 new teams join the grid. They were Virgin, Caterham, and HRT, which also stands for Hispanic Racing Team. And they were, with no kind words, they were shit. They were consistently getting close to that 107% rule. They were miles off the pace. The cars were insanely difficult to drive. And those 3 teams were kind of the laughing stock of the grid for that 3-year period between 2010 and 2012. But with these new regs, it kind of feels like we've got them back in the forms of Aston Martin being HRT, Williams being Marussia, and Cadillac being Caterham, because they're all massively slow, massively slower than everyone else, and they're shockingly unreliable. Obviously, Sainz nearly didn't start. Well, he didn't complete qualifying in Australia. You had Bottas conk out on lap 30 in Australia. Albon didn't start the Chinese Grand Prix. Cadillac are just mind-bogglingly slow, and then we all know what's happening to Aston Martin, with them only completing about 12 laps in Australia and then completing 35 today across both cars. So it is interesting how, with these regs, whenever we have a regulation change, there's always one team at least who just doesn't do well and just makes an absolute mess of them. But with these regs, we've got 3 teams who have messed it up, and all for different reasons. Quite interestingly, the Aston Martin has shown glimpses of speed, but it is shockingly unreliable. The Cadillac is just slow and is tearing itself apart with the bodywork. And then the Williams has a good engine package, but is horrendously overweight on the chassis. So they're all slow for different reasons, but they're all fairly close to each other on pace. But that said, we did see a few improvements from Aston Martin this weekend. We'll get onto that in the race a little bit. But, they've gone from not even making the 107% rule with Lance Stroll to now out-qualifying Cadillac. So that, while it is still shit, I think is a step in the right direction for Aston Martin, which means there are 11 teams, and it took them 2 races to out-qualify 1, which means, hopefully, by Abu Dhabi, they should be qualifying on pole. But we will have to see. Anyway, that is qualifying done. Let's move on to the race. Okay, anyway, we're going to get now into the race, the main event, which I think we are all here to talk about. And we're going to start, I've essentially tried to compile my notes into chronological order. Please excuse that message tone. But yes, we're going to try and do this in chronological order. I'm going to start from the very start, before the start, which is McLaren not starting the Grand Prix. Now, I was literally just saying before how if McLaren got their act together, they could challenge maybe towards the front of the field, at least in qualifying. I was kind of hinting at this because, they've just won the Constructors' title by some margin. They've got all this bonus cash, all this time to develop the car, and they're not even starting races. Like, come on. you know, they went through the slump with Honda. They don't have a Honda engine anymore. They've got the OP engine. You know, Alpine have the OP engine, and they're finishing P5 and P10. We'll get into that. But to not even be starting the Grand Prix, like, they've got to get their act together. Obviously, it was... I did a bit of digging into it, because I did kind of miss it when it happened. But it sounds like it was two unrelated electrical issues on both cars. So it was an electrical issue on Lando's car, and then it was a completely different problem on Oscar's car, which meant that neither of them could start. So, like, for a team which is trying to defend a Constructors' Championship, it's not really good enough. Like, you're defending a championship, you've got to be starting Grand Prix. You cannot be sitting in the pits with these sorts of issues. Because at this rate, you know, they are behind Haas. They're behind Haas in the Constructors' Championship, which is insanity to think about. But I digress. It's not looking great for McLaren. And if they keep going on this trajectory, they will not finish in the top 3 in the Constructors. Easily. They're going to get beaten by Alpine and Haas. Maybe not Red Bull, because I'll get into that as well. But yeah, there's not much to comment on with this, but it's not looking good for McLaren at the moment. But we're going to move on to the actual race start. Pardon me. Dear me. Yeah, we're going to move on to the actual race start. Obviously, you had Antonelli on pole, George second, Hamilton third, Leclerc fourth. And as you can tell by the image just down here, it was Hamilton that led us away into turn 1, and it very much is the theme with races at the moment. Ferrari will qualify third and fourth, there or thereabouts, and will be leading at the end of lap 1. And it is very much, that has very much been the theme so far in 2026. And it sort of makes you think, like, Ferrari, at least at this stage, they don't even really need to qualify on pole. Obviously, if they qualified on pole, it would be a lot easier for them. But they don't even need to do so, because every single time, as long as they qualify on the second row of the grid, they're in the lead by turn 1 anyway, because of the turbo spooling and then being able to fire up those turbos a lot quicker than Merc. So, it really comes down to, and this is for Ferrari fans, as long as Ferrari qualify on the second row of the grid or in 5th place, they should be leading by the end of turn 1. You can almost take Ferrari qualifying third as a bit of a mini pole position, because they are just going to be leading by turn 1. So it definitely provides them with an advantage over everybody else. And I think Mercedes do have to be worried, because if we get to a place where where one of the Ferraris do qualify on pole, then, you know, they are going to be light years ahead going into turn 1. If they do that. So it is very much keeping Mercedes honest, especially in qualifying, and then just rocketing ahead into turn 1 in the race. Like, it is going to be, I think it is going to be a problem for Merc later on in the season if Ferrari can find that, if Ferrari can find that qualifying form, because if they do, it's going to be very one-sided lap 1. But then also at the race start, moving away from Ferrari, so we had Verstappen bogging down and going from 8th to about 16th, being passed by the Aston Martins, some of the Cadillacs, Audis, all of them. And it's very much been a trend. It happened in the sprint race on Saturday. We are not sure if it happened in Australia. Obviously, he was starting last anyway, but it did sound like he had a bit of a bad start. And look, at least in the start department, you can definitely attribute his bad starts to the car. in terms of pace, it's kind of it's a bit of it's a 50-50 between Max and the car, but at least in the starts, it's just bogging down and he's not getting anywhere. I guess to be fair, Hadjar is able to start the car, which is good for Red Bull, but Max isn't able to start, and it's becoming a bit of a theme. So, makes for very interesting, viewing. And if it keeps on like this, he's never going to score any points. We saw him bog down. By the time he had his engine failure, he was running in 6th place. So, 6th place is still good points, but when you're Max Verstappen, you want to be in that top 4 a lot of the time. So, it's not looking good at the moment for Max, it really isn't. But we're going to keep moving on to basically this next point, which essentially happened for 40 of the 56 laps, and that is the Ferrari battle. Now, they basically spent the whole race swapping and changing positions, and Lewis was even fighting with Antonelli at one point at the beginning of the race, but it was, from an entertainment perspective, it was really, really good to watch. It's like watching them go side by side down into the hairpin, doing the switchback down the main straight, going around the outside at turn 1, which then becomes the inside for turn 2. That is also a huge credit to the track, because I feel as though China is a very slept-on track amongst F1 fans. But that that gave us a lot of good battling. And in a way, and this might sound a bit harsh, it may have cost Ferrari the win, but even more so, I actually think it cost George a chance at the win. I'm not saying it cost him the win, but it cost him a chance at the win. Because while the Ferraris are swapping and changing and knocking seven shades of shit out of each other, you've got George stuck behind them, not being able to get through. And, he was stuck behind for 20 or so laps, which made the gap between George and Antonelli go up to about 7.5, 8 seconds, which in, Formula 1 perspective is a fairly big gap, and one which George couldn't make back up. But that Ferrari battle was awesome, but I think if they want to win races, if they want to beat Mercedes later on in the year, I don't think there is going to be much room for that. Obviously, you've got two number 1 drivers at Ferrari. It is very much a McLaren 2025 scenario where you've got 2 number 1 drivers at Ferrari. So I think if it gets to the point where they're on the same bit of tarmac, whether they decide that on the spot or pre-race, someone is going to have to move over, because at the end of the day, one or the other is going to be quicker. Whether that's Lewis, whether that's Charles, that'll just happen at the time. But they're going to have to make a choice at some point, because you saw it at China today, or yesterday I should say, how they were battling and just costing themselves time. So I think if they get to a track where Ferrari is totally dominant and they're miles clear of Mercedes, it's not going to be an issue. But if we get to a track, let's say, I don't know, like Gilles Villeneuve or Austria or something like that, where they are right close together between Ferrari and Mercedes, someone's going to have to move over to extract the most pace out of it. But it's something interesting to talk about. Furthermore, we are going to keep moving along in this video, and we are now going to talk a little bit about Ollie Behrman, who finished in 5th place. Now, my standout driver prediction was a certain Ollie Behrman, so I'm very much going to be taking that. But what an awesome drive. It basically means now that with his P7 in Australia and his P5 in China, he's now 5th place in the driver's standings in a Haas. Like, I get it, we're in the 2 rounds in, but to be P5 in a Haas is no mean feat already. So that is very, very impressive. And honestly, judging by what we've seen in the first 2 races, is Ollie Behrman going to be the first sort of... Well, how shall I phrase this? Is he going to be the midfield driver? Is he going to be the midfield driver that is consistently a pain in the ass to the top 4 teams this year? Honestly, could be. I think he could be. I also think Pierre Gasly has a solid shout for that title as well. But Ollie Behrman putting in an absolutely phenomenal drive. Yes, he was a bit dicey on that one with Hadjar down in the final sector. That was a bit 50-50. But apart from that, brilliant drive, and that Haas is looking as good, I think, as it ever has looked. Obviously, it looked pretty good in 2018. Back then, but I think this could. I think they're setting themselves up for their best ever season in Formula One, Haas. I do genuinely think that. But wanted to make a quick mention of that. We're sort of getting into the end of this podcast now, so we're going to skim over a few things. Also, moving on to another standout team, Alpine with double points. Colapinto finally scoring a point for Alpine, and he was briefly running in second place, which I thought was quite amusing. But Alpine seemed to be on the up as well, scoring, what would that be? 25-18, 15-12, 10... 8, and then what? So nine points for Alpine in this race. So that's highly encouraging. I believe that puts them behind McLaren and ahead of Red Bull. So that's highly encouraging for the Frenchies over there. And there was Max DNFing. More mechanical issues for Red Bull. Obviously, we had Hadjar DNF in Australia, Max DNF in China. That a lot of people were praising the Ford powertrain in testing, saying, oh, the Ford powertrain, it's going to be the best one behind the Mercedes, it's going to be better than Ferrari, and it's going to be better than Audi and everything. Honestly, I was one of very few people who stuck with my gut and said that Ford engine was going to be a whole load of dick. And it is. I think it is the second worst engine, only ahead of Aston Martin. It's just not good. There's no performance in it. It's breaking down constantly. So what is there to say that it is better than like Audi? There's nothing. There's no case for it to say that the Ford engine is better than the Audi engine. And obviously the Audi is not as good as Ferrari and Mercedes. There's no case for it, which is a bit of a shame, but oh well. But I think that is all I wanted to cover for the race. So let's move on to predictions, shall we? Okay, so now, for the final segment of this video, we're going to look at predictions. For those of you who do not know, I make a predictions video before every race. We predict pole position, the top 5, a standout team, a standout driver, a crazy prediction, and a Destructors champion. But we're going to get into it. We are going to start with our pole position prediction. And for pole position, and this is all for the main race, I predicted George Russell for pole position, which I so thought I was going to have this come in. Obviously, he was on sprint pole, but not on main pole, so it doesn't count. But I went for George Russell for pole position, and it hasn't come in, so I've flopped there big time. Moving on, I've got them all here, by the way, as you can see. I'm reading them all. P5 in the race. I went for Oscar Piastri. Didn't come in. Obviously, McLaren didn't start, so another flop there. P4, I went for Lewis Hamilton, and that didn't come in. Another flop. I've got the Ferraris round the wrong way. P3, I went for Antonelli, which didn't come in. Another flop there. Not good. P2, I went for Charles Leclerc, which I think, as you can see, I have completely butchered the entire top 5. The entire top 5. which I am very washed, and it's only round 2. And then P1, I went for George Russell. So that is a bit of a flop. We are no points. So from six predictions, we got nothing. We're going to move it on to a standout team. I said Audi. I don't think you can claim that. I thought I was cooking with that one. I don't think you can claim that. Like, Hulkenberg was close to the points. Bortoletto didn't even start. He spun in qualifying. Hulkenberg didn't finish the sprint, so I don't think you can claim that as a standout team for Audi. Standout driver, I went for Oliver Behrman. That I am going to take. That is a W prediction. We're taking that every day of the week. My crazy prediction was that someone was going to have a tyre failure or suspension failure during the weekend. That did not happen, unfortunately. That was a bit of a long shot, that one. And then finally, my Destructors champion for the weekend was Liam Lawson, which did not come in, unfortunately. So that is a bit of a shame. That didn't come in. But oh well. Bit of washed. I say a bit of washed. I'm very washed on the predictions come in. Also, on the predictions this week. We made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 predictions, and I only got one of them. So China, not my best work. But finally, for the final part of this video, we're going to do a quick reflection on fantasy, which I'm bringing up right now on my phone. My team. So, for my team, I went for George Russell with the 2 times boost. That's a W. That's not too bad. I went for Charles Leclerc. Also not bad. I went for Valtteri Bottas as a cheap option. He finished like P14. It's not horrific, but it's not great either. I went for Nico Hulkenberg, which isn't too bad. I'll take Nico Hulkenberg, I think, any day of the week. And then bought. Oh god, bad stutter, jeez. And then Bortoletto, who didn't start, so a bit of a flop there. Also went for Ferrari as my first team, and then went for Haas as my second team. So, in the teams department, definitely doing well. In the drivers department, I'm kind of flopping a little bit. But we will workshop that for the next race. But that is going to be it. But hopefully you all enjoyed, everybody. That is going to conclude another weekend review. Hopefully you are all enjoying this series. That is going to be it for me. I don't really have much of an outro to do today. So I'm going to see you all in 2 weeks' time for Japan. Stay safe, have an awesome day, make awesome choices, and I'm going to see you all in the next video. Take care, everybody!